Okay, good morning. Two apologies up front. Well, hopefully we'll get this set up so I'm not wearing the mask, but for today we'll wear it. And also, I don't have the dedications yet, so hopefully we'll get them at some point and be able to announce that. So today's daf is daf Zayin 7 in Eruvin, and we are going to pick up 3 lines from the bottom on Vav Amud Beis. So what happened was we were dealing with the case, as we discussed yesterday, of a U-shaped mavoi, where it had 2 bends in it. And what they practiced in Nahardai with such a mavoi was they put 2 doors at the bottom of the bends, and they put a lechi at each of the tops, at the top of where the 2 mavois met the Rishus Harabim. And the issue that we said was this matched neither Rav nor Shmuel, because according to Rav, it makes sense. Rav is the one who says that a bent mavoi, the fact that it's bent doesn't matter, and if it touches Rishus Harabim on both ends, then it needs to be treated like a mavoi mefulush. So that makes sense why we're dealing with things at the corners, but yet it doesn't make sense because according to Rav holds that the halacha is like the Tanakama, you only need Tzuras HaPesach. You need the shape of a door, but not an actual door, and yet in Nardai they put actual doors. So it doesn't seem to be going like Rav. But it's also not going like Shmuel, because Shmuel paskins like Hananya in the name of Beis Hillel that you need doors, so it makes sense why we have doors. But according to Shmuel, we wouldn't need this at all, because Shmuel is the one that says that a bent mavoi, a mavoi akum, is considered like a mavoi sasum, like a closed mavoi, and therefore we wouldn't need doors at all. We would just be able to put a lechi on each of these mavois, and that should be enough. So the Gemara is saying, it's strange, in Nardai they paskin like the chumrah of Rav to treat it like a mavoi mefulush, and they paskin like the chumrah of Shmuel to require a door rather than opening a Tzuras HaPesach. So it seems the halacha doesn't follow anyone, and the question that the Gemara is now dealing with is we brought a brisa that said, in dealing with Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, it said that you should not adopt the chumras of each. That is, a person who does that, the pasuk that goes on him is the pasuk in Koheles, which says, Haksio b'choshech cholech, that a fool walks in darkness, someone who adopts the chumras of 2 different people in ways that they themselves would never paskin. So that's the question that we have on the practice in Nardai, was why would you pick the chumras of Rav and the chumrah of Shmuel in a way that neither Rav nor Shmuel would ever paskin in that fashion? So that's the fundamental question we're dealing with. But first, the Gemara has to dispense with a different question, which is as follows, that the brisa that says you shouldn't pick the chumras of each, it started by saying, la'olam, in all cases, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, and then it proceeded to say, but if you want, choose Beis Hillel or choose Beis Shammai, your choice. And just as long as you choose Beis Hillel with their chumras and kulos, or choose Beis Shammai with their chumras and kulos, but it's your choice to pick. So that's where our Gemara picks up and says, before we get to answering the question of why in Nardai they adopted a double chumrah, let's just understand this brisa. Hagufa kasha, this itself is a question. Amrit, you said in the beginning of the brisa, la'olam halacha k'Beis Hillel, that the halacha always follows Beis Hillel and not Beis Shammai, and therefore you should practice like Beis Hillel. V'hadar Amrit, and then the brisa continues and says, Harotza lasu k'divrei Beis Shammai oseh, and if someone wants to do like Beis Shammai, they can do it. So which is it? Either the halacha is like Beis Hillel and not like Beis Shammai, in which case you should do like Beis Hillel, but then the brisa says, but if you want, you could choose like Beis Hillel. So the Gemara says, lo kasha, kan kodem baskol, kan la'achar baskol. So this is a reference to Gemara, which we'll Emertz Hashem learn on Shabbos, I think, which has to do with the fact that there was a machlokas, long machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and ultimately the Gemara concluded that we paskin like Beis Hillel. So therefore, it's a little bit weird element of a brisa, but the brisa in the beginning that says la'olam, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, that was going after the Baskol announced that we follow Beis Hillel. And the part that says pick whoever you want, pick Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, that was going before the Baskol, when there had not yet been a psak of the Baskol to say that the halacha follows Beis Hillel. If we have time at the end of this year today, maybe we'll talk about some of how that plays out lemaisa. But that's the Gemara's first answer. Or says the Gemara, v'ibay sema hava halachar Baskol. Maybe both the beginning and the ratio and the seifa of the Baskol are dealing the ratio and seifa of the Bryce are dealing after the Baskol. So we're not setting up a structure where the beginning of the Brisa was said for one period of time and the Sefer for a different one. But we're going to make a different distinction. We're going to say the Brisa is Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yeshua, the lo mishkach bevaskol. Rabbi Yeshua is the one who says you don't listen to a baskol. What is this? A reference to a famous Gemara in Bava Metzia with the case of Taner Shalachnoi. It was a question of Tumah and Tara of an oven that was split into rings. In any event, there was an entire story there that Rabbi Eliezer had a view that was opposite from the Chachamim. And the halacha is achrei rabim lahatos, that we go after the majority. So the Chachamim's view should have prevailed. And what happened was, a series of nisim miracles happened to try and demonstrate that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. And ultimately, a baskol, a voice came out from Shemayim and said the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. And yet Rabbi Yeshua got up and said, we don't care. We're not going to listen to the baskol. Why? Because lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah tells us that the Torah, once it was given, it doesn't reside in the heavens. And therefore, humans need to make their best effort at psak, knowing the rules that they know. And that's it. We don't listen to a baskol. Once the Torah was given to humans, it's no longer decided in Shemayim. So Rabbi Yeshua was the one who said, we don't listen to a baskol. So therefore, we're now no longer going to understand our brisa as dealing with two different times. We're going to understand it as dealing with two different people. So that the view that says Olam, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, is going according to the view that once the baskol said that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, so we have to follow that. And the one who says you can pick whatever you want, do like Beis Hillel, do like Beis Shammai, was going according to the view that we don't listen to a baskol. So we don't care if the baskol came out and said that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, because at the end of the day, we don't listen to a baskol. So now that's another understanding of the brisa. Beginning is according to the view we do listen to a baskol, therefore halacha is like Beis Hillel, and the end is like Rabbi Yeshua, who says we don't listen to a baskol, and therefore, despite the baskol that said that the halacha follows Beis Hillel, we are going to say you could choose what you want according to Rabbi Yeshua. V'ba Yisema, a third teretz, says the Gemara, second line on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, Hachi Kamar. This is what it's saying. It actually doesn't really mean Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, because in fact, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the halacha is you would always follow Beis Hillel. That's what it's saying at the beginning. That which it says at the end, you could choose between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the Gemara is going to say, that's just using Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as prototypical examples of people who argue, because we know Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel often argue. So it's saying, in general, when there's an argument, so let's just read it inside. It says, Hachi Kamar, this is what the end of the brisa is saying. Kol hecha de mishkachas trei tanayu trei amorai de pligi. Anytime you find Tanayim or Amoraim who are arguing, the pligi adadi who argue on one another, ke'ein machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, just like Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel often argue about matters. Then continues the sefer of the brisa, lo le'avid kikulei damar, kikulei damar. You shouldn't do like the kulas of each of those disputants, v'lo kechumrei damar, v'kichumrei damar, and nor should you adopt the chumras of each of the disputants. Ella, rather, what should you do? O kikulei damar, kechumrei avid, o kikulei damar, kechumrei avid. But pick one person and adopt their chumras and their kulas, and you can pick either person. So what it's saying is, the beginning was saying Olam halachas kebeis Hillel is telling you when you have an actual machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, you paskin like Beis Hillel. The end of the brisa that says pick whoever you want as long as you're consistent and take them for their kulas and chumras, it used an example of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, but that's actually not a perfect example, because in a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, you would choose Beis Hillel. But in general, it's telling you when there are disputants, there are Tanaim or Amoraim who argue, pick one or the other. Don't try to do like the chumras of each, and don't try to do like the kulas of each. Someone who does like the kulas of each is a rasha, and someone who does like the chumras of each is a fool. So says the Gemara, okay, so we've now resolved the beginning of that brisa and the end of that brisa to say why it's not a stira on each other, but we're still left with our fundamental question, which was the reason we brought the brisa in the first place, which was why in the case of a mavoi akum, in this U-shaped mavoi in Nahardai, did they adopt the chumras of Rav and Shmuel in ways that Rav or Shmuel themselves would never have paskin that way? So Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, Kulo karav avdua. So he said, really, both the fact that they treated it as a mavoi mefulish, and they also required a deles, actually is entirely consistent with Rav. The Amar of Huna Marav, halacha v'ein morin came. Because, in fact, the halacha, that the fact that Rav paskind, like the Tanakama, to say that all you need is a tzuras haPesach and a lechi, you don't need a door. He says that was a halacha that's the actual halacha. L'maisa, you could paskin like the Tanakama, but we don't announce that rule. So this is a concept that we have, that sometimes there's a concern that if you tell people the actual halacha, it'll come to create an environment of laxity, and that people aren't going to end up keeping the halacha properly. So if someone comes to you individually and asks you, you tell them the real halacha. But in public, in general, you wouldn't say it. So therefore, what they're saying is as follows. Rav halacha l'maisa, if someone came to him personally, would tell people, you don't need a door. It's enough to have a tzuras HaPesach. But he didn't want to announce that to the public. So therefore, in Nahardai, it was Rav who said we treat, even though it's a bent mavoi, a mavoi akum, a U-shaped mavoi, we still treat it like a mavoi mefulish. That's Rav's regular halacha. And the fact that they put up doors rather than tzuras HaPesach is because Rav felt that for public dissemination, it's better to have doors, and therefore, in this case, for the community of Nardai, they put doors. So that's the first answer, is that we're not actually adopting the chumras of Rav and Shmuel. We are adopting the position of Rav as it relates to Mavim Mefulish, his regular position, and as it relates to doors versus tzuras HaPesach, we're adopting his psak for public consumption. Okay, that's the first teretz. So Ravada Barava Amar Rav Amar Halacha Morin came. But wait a second. What about Ravada Barava in the name of Rav, who said no? We actually paskin like the Tanakama and say that all you need is a tzuras HaPesach. So according to that view, why is it that we're required doors? It seems that we've adopted the chumras of Rav that it's mavim mefulish, and the chumras of Shmuel that you need to put doors. Maya Kamemar, what are you going to say? So Rav Shizbi says, I'll explain to you why we actually did adopt the chumrah of Rav and the chumrah of Shmuel. Why did we do that? Kilo avdinon kechumri de beitrei hechad sasri adadi. So he says, when is it, when the Brisa says that if you adopt the chumras of two different disputants, you're a fool, that's where the halachas are interdependent. And therefore, the actions you're taking are going to be contradictory. So let's just, the Gemara is going to bring an example, so I'll explain it once we bring the example. Kugon, shedra v'gulgolas, like the case of a spine and a skull. So what is that? The snan, we've encountered this a number of times as we've gone through Daf Yomi, but in any event, hasedra v'hagulgolas shechasru. So the halacha is as follows, that we dealt with this briefly earlier in Eruvin, that etzem kisaora, a bone of that's tameh, can even the size of a barley corn, when we were talking about the different measurements that fit to the 7 minim. But in any event, a barley corn is metame if someone touches it. But we know that a dead body not only conveys tumah by touch, but also by ohel. If it's underneath the same roof, if someone is underneath the same roof as a piece of a dead body, so the halacha then is that they become tameh. But Tumas Oel does not work unless you have a certain shear. It might be a size of meat, it might be a majority of the skeletal structure, but also if the spine or the skull is intact, that even if that is enough to allow for tumah to transfer by Oel, by being under the same roof. So now, what happens if you have a spine or skull that's missing part? So do we treat that like a spine and a skull and say that it still transmits tumah by OL? Or do we say at the end of the day, you're missing enough of this spine or this skull that we're going to say that that's not a spine or a skull, and therefore it's only going to be metame by touch, but not by OL, not by being under the same roof. So says the Mishnah, if we're talking about a spine or a skull that's missing part, how much can be missing that we still consider it, that we no longer consider it a spine or a skull? How much is missing in a spine that we say this is no longer a spine and doesn't transfer tumah by all? Two vertebrae. Beis Hillel says one vertebrae. So therefore, Beis Hillel is the more lenient view here, because he's saying once the spine is missing one vertebrae, I don't know if that's the right singular term, but whatever, one vertebra is missing, we're gonna say that that's no longer a spine. Beis Shammai says if one vertebrae is missing, it's still a spine, and therefore it's going to be matama by OL. It's only when it's missing two vertebrae that we say at that point it's no longer a spine. Okay, that's fine. And what about with a skull? Beis Shammai kimlo makdeach, ubeis Hillel kadesh hinatachai. min achai v'yamos. So as it relates to a skull, Beis Shammai says a makdeach is like a manual tool. That's like a drill. It makes holes in wood. So a makdeach cut a certain size hole. This is addressed in Bechoros. We're not going to get into it now. Beis Hillel says if you take enough, if there's enough missing from the skull, that you would take that amount of a skull from a live person, the person would die. That's the amount that once it's missing from a skull, that you would no longer be able to. The skull would no longer transfer tumah by oil and only by touch. Okay, so far it's good. We have machlokas, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. How much needs to be missing from a spine in order to continue? How much could be missing from a spine and still be able to transfer via oil? But continues, Ram Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, v'chein le'inyan treifa. And the same argument is going to work by treifa, because the question is, it's the same. So what's the question by treifa? The idea by treifa is that a treifa is a problem in an animal that of which there are many, which we're going to say that would cause the animal to die, and therefore, even if you shech the animal in this current state, it's not going to be valid shchita, and you're not able to eat this animal, right? So two of the chesronos of treifa, two of the treifa instances are where it is missing part of its skull or missing part of its spine. So therefore, we're going to say that the machlokes is the same. And so if it's now, what happens is that Beis Hillel becomes the machmer one, because Beis Hillel is going to say that if you're missing even one vertebra from the spine, then this is something that is a treifa. Versus Beis Shammai is going to say if you're missing one vertebra, it's not yet a treifa. You could still shecht it and eat it. It only becomes a treifa when it's missing two. So now what happens is you have Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel each articulating a standard. What is it that makes a spine or a skull no longer a spine or skull? But the rule is going to be the same whether you're dealing with a treifa or you're dealing with with the question of whether it transmits by a oel. But here's the issue. If you adopt Beis Hillel's view, so you're being mako, you have a lenient view in the case of tumah transferring, but you end up with a more restrictive view on how quickly does an animal become a treifa. Versus if you go Beis Shammai, you have a restrictive view on tumah, but you have a lenient view on treifa. So therefore, what happens is if you choose the chumrah of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, you're a fool, because there's one underlying rule here. Either this is the amount that causes a spine or a skull to be no longer intact, or this is the amount. Once you decide the reality of that question, it applies in both places, l'kulo and l'chumrah. So if you pick the chumras of each, you're like, it makes no sense, because you're picking things that are mutually inconsistent. They can't possibly be that way because they're internally inconsistent and internally contradictory. But where they don't conflict with each other, meaning it's not the same underlying reason, there you could do it. So therefore, the Gemara's answer back to our question of this mavui and nardai was, it's not a problem for us to pick the chumrah of Rav and the chumrah of Shmuel. We're not fools when it's not a case of uksiel b'choshech cholech. Why? Because Rav is machmer by the question of mavui mafulish, which is a mavui that opens in two ends to Rosh Hashanah, and Shmuel is machmer by a halacha of do you need a tzuras haPesach or do you need a delas itself? But those are not mutually interdependent machlokesim. So you could choose to pick. You're not a fool if you pick the chumras of each. But if you pick the chumras of each in a machlokes where the same logic dictates a result in both cases, and you pick a chumrah of each, so then you're creating a halachic scenario that makes no sense, because either the rule is one way or the other, and it has a consequence. So that's the Gemara's answer. So ask the Gemara, okay, that sounds good. So that explains what happened in our day. But is it true? Is it true that we never adopt the chumras of each, even where they conflict with each other? Masav Reb Misharshi asked the question as follows: Ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva shaliket esrog be'echad b'shvat v'noag bo beis isurin echad kedivrei Beis Shammai ve'echad kedivrei Beis Hillel. Okay, so what's going on here? So we know that you when you grow produce, you have to take truma, you have to take Meiser Rishon, and then what happens is after you've taken Meiser Rishon, you take another 10%, and depending on the year, you do something different with it. So if it's the first, the second, or the fourth, or the fifth years of Shemitah, then you bring Meiser Sheni and you take the fruit or produce to Yerushalayim and you eat it there. If it's the third or the sixth year of the Shemitah cycle, then you don't do that. You don't take the food to Yerushalayim, but rather you give it to the ani. So now, the question is as follows. As relates to if you're picking an esrog, the question is, when does you go from the second year to the third year for purposes of picking an esrog, that you would shift from giving the esrog to Meiser Sheni, which would be appropriate in the second year, to giving it in the third year, which would mean you're giving Meiser Ani. So now, we know from the first Mishnah of Rosh Hashanah, famous Mishnah, that talks about Daled Rosh Hashanah Heim, that there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs. The Rosh Hashanah for Peiros HaElon is a Machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So one view is it's Echad B'Shvat, and the other is that it's 2 B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat. So what happened? Rabbi Akiva was picking an esrog, and he picked it, let's say, on the 5th day of Shvat. So the issue is as follows. According to Beis Shammai, it's already the new year for fruit, and therefore it's the third year, and you should give Meiser Ani with this esrog. But if according to Beis Hillel, the third year hasn't started yet. We're still in the second year on the 5th of Shvat, because the third year only starts on Tu B'Shvat, on the 15th. So therefore, you should be giving Meiser Sheni, not Meiser Ani, because it was picked in the second year. So what happened? Rabbi Akiva picked his esrog, to use our example, on the 5th day of Shvat. So what did he do? He brought both Meiser Sheni and Meiser Ani. So now says the Gemara, wait a second. Those are contradictory. Either Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanos is the 1st of Shvat, in which case you're bringing Meiser Ani, or it's the 15th of Shvat, in which case you're bringing Meiser Sheni. You can't possibly craft a scenario where you have to bring both, and yet Rabbi Akiva did that. So you see, even in a case where they're mutually inconsistent, it's a contradictory action. The logic of what you're doing by being machmer on both makes no sense, yet Rabbi Akiva did it. So says the Gemara, you just finished telling me where the logic makes no sense, we don't do it, and yet we see Rabbi Akiva did it. So answers the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva gamrei istapikle, v'lo yada ibeis helo b'chad b'shvat amar, ib'chamesa b'shvat amar. V'avid hachal l'chumra, v'hachal l'chumra. So he says as follows, the issue was not that Rabbi Akiva was trying to be a machmer, and he was adopting the chumras of each, because in fact you wouldn't do that in this case, because there's an underlying logic. There's one day, pick, do you paskin that it's the 1st of Shvat or the 15th of Shvat? So what happened was, Rabbi Akiva knew the halacha follows Beis Hillel, we know that. And his issue was, he didn't know whether the tradition, the gamrei, what he had heard about who holds the 1st of Shvat and who holds the 15th of Shvat. So on the basis that possibly it's Beis Hillel holds the 1st of Shvat, that he said that he was going to separate Meiser Ani for the third year, and it was on the basis that maybe Beis Hillel holds that it's Tu B'Shvat, and therefore it's still the second year, that he brought Meiser Sheni. So we're going to explain that Rabbi Akiva was not adopting 2 chumras. He wanted to do like Beis Hillel. He just didn't know what Beis Hillel's rule was. So again, we'll read it. Rabbi Akiva gamrei estapikle, his tradition, he had a suffix about it. V'lo yada, he didn't know. Beis Hillel b'chad b'shvat amar, ib'chamesa b'shvat amar. Did Beis Hillel say the 1st or the 15th? V'avid hachal l'chumra, v'hachal l'chumra. So he did l'chumra not because he was choosing to do 2 chumras, but because he was lacking knowledge of which opinion was actually legitimately the one of Beis Hillel. Okay, says the Gemara, Yosef Reb Yosef kamed Rav Huna v'Yosef v'kamar. Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna, and he was sitting, and he said, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Machlokas. Which machlokas are we talking about? We're going back to the machlokas between the Tanakama and Beis Hillel according to Chananya. So again, Chananya said this is machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and obviously the halacha follows Beis Hillel. So even though there's the view of Beis Shammai, we're going to ignore that for the moment. So we have a machlokas that the Tanakama says when you have a mavoi mefulosh, a mavoi that's open on both ends to a Rishus HaRabim, that it's enough to that if you have a mavoi mefulosh, it's enough to have a tzuras haPesach and to have a tzuras haPesach and a lechi. Now, according to Chananya, who says Beis Hillel actually opines on this, he's going to say no, it's not enough to have a tzuras haPesach and a lechi. You need a delas and a lechi. You need an actual door. Okay, so comes Rav Yosef in front of Rav Huna and says, in the name of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Machlokas b'sartia mikan v'sartia mikan. When do we have this idea that a mavoi mefulish needs either a door or a tzuras HaPesach on one side and a lechi or kar on the other, that's where you have the mavoi that is mefulish opens on both sides to a thoroughfare, to a road that's a public road or Rishus Harabim, uplati mikan, or a square, like a town square that qualified as a Rishus Harabim. That basically what he's saying is they argue where both ends of the mavoi are in a Rishus Harabim d'oraisa. Aval sartia mikan, ubika mikan, but if you have a highway on this side and a valley on the other side, which would be not a Rishus Harabim but a Carmelis, or you have a so he says, Aval sarti mikan bika mikan, o bika mikan, or alternatively, you have a mavoi that opens on both ends to a bika, to a Carmelis. So in that case, we're not going to consider it a mavoi mefulish, or we're not going to have a machlokas about that. Everyone's going to agree, osa tzuras HaPesach mikan, v'lechi v'kar mikan, that if you have a mavoi that's open on two ends, if the opening is not to a Rishus Harabim on both ends, then the Tanakama and Beis Hillel don't argue. The Tanakama and Beis Hillel only argue when the two ends of the mavoi open into Rishus Harabim d'oraisa. So now, the Brisa used an interesting case. It said, if we're dealing with one side Rishus Harabim and one side of Carmelis, or two sides Carmelis, then they don't argue. But ask the Gemara, why did you have to say the two sides Carmelis? Hashda sartia mikana bika mikan oselo tzuras HaPesach mikan v'lechi v'kar mikan. So he says, if in a case where you have one side Rishus Harabim and one side of Carmelis, they don't argue, then bika mikan and bika mikan mibai. So then, why did you have to tell me the case if you have a Carmelis on both sides? If when you even have a Carmelis on one side, they don't argue, surely no one requires an actual deles when it's Carmelis on both ends. So we're trying to understand, why would he have said that? So the Gemara says, Hachi ka'amar, sartia mikan, ubika mikan, nasa kebika mikan, ubika mikan. He's saying as follows. They're not actually saying two cases. They're not talking about Rishus Harabim on one side and a Carmelis on the other, plus the case of Carmelis on both sides. It's saying, if you have a Rishus Harabim d'oraisa on one side and a Carmelis on the other side, we're going to treat that just like a case where a mavoi opened to a Carmelis on both sides, which everyone would agree. It's obvious that in that case, they don't argue and a tzuras HaPesach would be enough. So that's what he meant. He meant that when do we have this machlokas between Tanakama and Beis Hillel is when you have both sides of the mavoi open to Rishus Harabim d'oraisa. But if either side opens to a Carmelis, we're going to treat that like something that has a Carmelis on both sides, and no one would say that you need to have an actual doorway there. So this is good, but the problem is that Rav Yosef, sitting in front of Rav Huna, proceeded to say another halacha, which is going to become complicated. So says the Gemara, U'Mesayim ba mishmei Rav Yehuda. So let's just see that when he said this halacha, Rav Yosef sat in front of Rav Huna, and he said a halacha in the name of Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, which Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav. He then said a second halacha, and he said, I'm saying in the name of Rav Yehuda, who is his Rebbe, but he didn't say whether Rav Yehuda said his halacha like Rav or not. Again, so the first halacha he said, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. The second halacha he just said, Amar Rav Yehuda. What was the halacha that he said? He said, Im haya mavoi kol rechava ein tzarich klum. So he says as follows, that if the mavoi open to a rechava, you don't need anything. Okay, so let's just understand what's the case we're talking about here. So a regular mavoi is, you have a Rishus Harabim here, you go up to, you have a mavoi that goes up from it, right? A mavoi, it consists of at least two chutzner areas opening onto that place. That's a mavoi, right? So now, what happened with this? So you have such a Rishus Harabim, you have your mavoi going up, you have your openings to the two chutzers, and there's a wall in front of you. Now what happens? That wall, let's say that wall is not there. And what is there is a rechava. A rechava is basically, the way Rashi explains it, it's the back of the houses. It's a place where people just put stuff. They don't live there, right? It's not a place that they really live. So it's like a Rishus HaYachid that has no diurin, it has no residence. So the halacha would be as follows. So what do you have? And then to make it more complicated, the rechava, this uninhabited area, the wall that is directly opposite the mavoi now broke open, and now there's an opening all the way to a Rishus Harabim. So if I'm starting down in my Rishus Harabim here, I have a mavoi, but the wall in front of me at the end of the mavoi fell down, or it wasn't there. And then from there I had a rechava, which is some kind of uninhabited area, and then beyond the rechava was an opening to Rishus Harabim. So the halacha that he's saying is as follows: even though technically speaking you can walk out of the Rishus Harabim down here, walk through the mavoi, through the rechava, and into Rishus Harabim, we're not going to treat this like a mavoi mefulush, and we're going to treat that like a mavoi sasam, a closed mavoi. What do you need if you have a mavoi sasam? I just need to put on my bottom where my mavoi meets the Rishus Harabim, the bottom Rishus Harabim. I just need to put a lechi or kara. So that was his halacha. Okay, so Amalei Abayil Rav Yosef. So this was Rav Yosef saying this in front of Rav Huna, and he was quoting the first thing he said, Amar Rav Yehuda Marad. The second one he just said, Amar Rav Yehuda. So Rabbiya said to Rav Yosef, Had Rav Yehuda the Shmuel. The second halacha that you said in the name of Rav Yehuda was actually not Rav Yehuda in the name of his Rebbe Rav, but was Rav Yehuda in the name of his Rebbe Shmuel. Why? Because we're going to see that it argues on Rav, Amar Beis. So says the Gemara, the Rav, because if this second halacha about this rechava is you were quoting your Rebbe Rav, kasha the Rav betarti. We're going to have a stira between the halacha you just said with Rav in two ways. We're going to have a stira. Okay, so now let me just take a second to talk about two things before we get started. So one is so first let me just tell you the structure of the Gemara we're going to deal with as follows. We brought a halacha. Rabbi Yehuda said it in the name of someone. Rabbi Yosef says it was in the name of Shmuel. Because it was in the name of Rav, we have two steers. We have a problem with the halacha you just said with something else that Rav said. Then the Gemara is going to say, but you know what? It's not, this is a very Jewish thing. He's going to say, you know what? It's not actually a machlokas because there's a reason that it's not actually a stira. Okay. Then the Gemara is going to say, well, okay, but if they did argue, what would they have been arguing about? So it's a funny structure, right? In other words, we're going to say, it seems they argue. We say, no, they don't argue. And then they're going to say, well, let's say they were arguing. What are they arguing about? So that's just the structure of the Gemara, and we'll follow that. The other thing I just want to introduce for a moment is there's a concept that's called mavoi shenifritz b'mulua lechatzer that we have a concept of paritz b'muluya l'makam asrlo. So this is an idea of as follows: that if you have a space that opens to another space, that is, they are fully open, at least from the first space to the second space, and you cannot carry from the first space to the second space, right? So this is a regular halacha in Hilchos Eruvin. It comes up a number of times in this Masechta. So the halacha is, if in the first space you cannot carry to the second space, but yet the first space is fully open to the second space, then you cannot carry even in the first space. Okay? That's the halacha. It's a halacha in Eruvin generally. It's going to become relevant to our sugya, so I just wanted to introduce it here. Okay, so we have as follows. We have a halacha, Rav Yehuda, which Rav Yosef says, he's saying in the name of Shmuel, that if you have a mavoi that's open to a rechava, and that rechava is open to Rishus Harabim, we don't care that this mavoi you could walk through from the bottom to the top, from one Rishus Harabim to another. We don't treat it like a mavoi mefulish. We said that's a problem with Rav. Why? Because the Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav, because Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said in the name of Rav, mavoi shenifratz b'melua lechatzer. So this is actually very, very similar to the case of rechava. The only difference is you had your Rishus Harabim, you had your mavoi, and the end wall of the mavoi broke down. But instead of there being a rechava behind, there's a chatzer behind. Now, just to be clear, this chatzer was not a chatzer that traversed through this mavoi. It had its entranceway somewhere else, but it was behind the wall of the mavoi. Now that wall fell down in its entirety. So therefore, when you're looking in this mavoi, you're looking down this mavoi, you're then seeing through the chatzer, and then the wall on the other side of the chatzer fell down also and opened to Rishus Harabim. So now, again, it's kind of the same case. You have Rishus Harabim at the bottom. You walk through the Mavoi, you walk through the Chatzar, you're going to hit a Rishus Harabim. Right? So that's the case we're dealing with. Sounds very familiar. In fact, on surface, the only difference between these cases, and this is going to be the Gemara's Kasha, the only difference between these cases seems to be one case is talking about a Rechava, and one case is talking about a Chatzar. So says the Gemara, so what's the halacha according to Rav? Chatzar muteres umavoi asar. So the chatzar is mutter and the mavoi is asar. So now we're going to say as follows. Why is the chatzar mutter? So now, just to explain the case a little better, and I know some people have pictures or whatever, but not everyone does, so I'll try and explain it. The mavoi goes like this. The wall of the mavoi fell down in its entirety, and it's now open to a chatzar. But the chatzar actually goes wider than both sides of the mavoi, right? So it's almost like you have the mavoi and you have a T, that's the chatzar. So the chatzar goes, you could go to the right or left once you walk into the chatzar. So now, if you think about it, let's forget the mavoi view for a moment and imagine we're the residents of this chatzar. So what do we have? We have an entryway somewhere else, whatever, and now we develop two holes. Tough day. They developed two holes in their chatzar, one that opened up to the mavoi, and one that opened up to Rishus Harabim. Those holes are less than 10 amas wide, and they're in a direct line of the mavoi. But if I'm standing in the chatzar, if I'm looking at the mavoi, I got this hole in my wall to the mavoi, I'm looking at the mavoi, what do I see? I see a mavoi in front of me, I see one of my walls to my right and one of my walls to my left. So what do we know? We know the halacha is if you have walls and the standing part is greater than the open part and it's less than 10 amas wide, what is that treated as? It's treated as a doorway. So I have a doorway that leads to a mavoi. That doesn't preclude me from carrying in my own chatzar. Now, if the guy turns around 180 degrees and looks at the wall, at the hole that was just created between his chatzar and the Rishus Harabim, so what does he have? He has a hole less than 10 amos wide leading from his chatzar to Rishus Harabim, but he has a wall to his right and he has a wall to his left. So what is that? It's a Pesach, it's a door. So therefore, the chatzar has two doors. One leads to a mavoi, one leads to Rishus Harabim. Big deal. It doesn't preclude you from carrying because a doorway leaving your chatzar doesn't create a problem. As long as it's not greater than 10 amos, which would make it a breach, or it's not, the opening is greater than the walled portion, we're good. So that's why the halacha of Rav is the chatzar is mutter. But Rav says the mavoi is asar. Now, the Gemara is going to assume in the beginning, why is Rav saying that the mavoi is asar? Because when you, at the end of the day, when you're standing at this bottom Rishus Harabim, you're looking at your mavoi, what are you seeing at the other end? You're seeing through your mavoi, through the chatzar, to Rishus Harabim. And what do you have? So you're basically, I'm standing in this Rishus Harabim, I'm looking through a mavoi and a chatzar to another Rishus Harabim. So that should be, even though, technically speaking, you're traversing a mavoi followed by a chatzar, at the end of the day, this looks like a mavoi mefulish. So we should therefore, so we're going to say that seems to be a problem, and that's why the mavoi is going to be asar. Okay? So that I'm going to explain this a little better in a second, but I just want to get the question out there a little bit. So the issue now is, so ask the Gemara, V'amai lahave k'mavoi shekol l'rachava. So why are these halachas different? We have almost the exact same case. One case, the mavoi opened to a rachava, and in the other case, it opened to a chatzar. Who cares if it's a rachava, mavoi? Why is it different? So basically, we see that whereas Rav Yehuda paskined on Amud Aleph, that you can carry in the mavoi. You don't need anything. You just have your one regular lechi at the bottom and you're good. And Rav said you're not allowed to carry in the mavoi at all. Okay, so I've given a very simplistic approach to this. That's the Gemara's basic question. But if you noticed, the Gemara said that this is a kasha on Rav in two areas that they seem to be having an argument. So in order to understand this, we're going to have to walk through this a little better. So because basically what the Gemara does is it makes an implication, a diuk, from each of the statements, and that diuk, those diukim, those inferences, are going to be contradictory. So how so? Because Rabbi Yehuda said that if the mavoi cracked down and opened to a rechava, which is an uninhabited area, in that case, everything is mutter. But if it would be a chatzer, right, which is inhabited, that would be a problem. So this inference makes sense, because he obviously chose a funny case of a rechava, which has no residence, and if it has no residence, there's no notion that one should aser on the other. So, but he specifically chose a rechava. He didn't choose a chatzer. So it must be that he sees a problem with there being a chatzer and a mavoi that opens onto the chatzer. Now, what Rav Yehuda does not have a problem with is he does not have a problem with the fact that when I'm standing down here in my Rosh Hashanah, I'm looking right through to another Rosh Hashanah. That doesn't bother him, because if that bothered him, that would be true even when it's a rechava. So obviously, Rav Yehuda is not concerned about mefulash, but he seems to be concerned about a mavoi opening onto a chatzar. So now let's analyze, why would Rav Yehuda be concerned about a mavoi opening onto a chatzar? This is why I referenced before, that because when I'm standing in the mavoi, my mavoi opens in its entirety. The full length, the full width of my mavoi wall fell down and now opens into a chatzar. That chatzar I cannot carry from the mavoi to the chatzar. Why? Because any Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah you can't carry unless you have some kind of Eruv. And I have no Eruv. So therefore, Rav Yehuda is going to say, so once the mavoi is open in its entirety to the chatzar, what did I tell you before? That if you have one area opens into another area to which you cannot carry, then the first area you can't carry either. So says Rav Yehuda, I have a case of where it's paritz b'meluo, it's fully open to an area I cannot carry to, so therefore I cannot carry in my mavoi. Okay? So this is Rav Yehuda's halacha, which is basically the way we're understanding, and this is actually going to be lemaskana. The way Rav Yehuda learns is, I don't care about mafulash. We'll see why later. But he said, but I do care, and I don't care if a mavoi opens to a rechava, because a rechava you can carry between it's an uninhabited place. But I do care if the mavoi opens into the chatzar, because at the end of the day, because that's the halacha, parts b'melua l'makam ha'aser lo, that you cannot carry in the mavoi. So that is the implication of Rabbi Yehuda, is that he would be concerned about a chatzar. Comes Rav, and Rav says as follows. We're going to ignore his thing. I explained to you before his halacha of chatzar, why you could carry in the chatzar, because for them it's just two psachim. But let's focus on Rav's halacha. Rav says that the carry in the mavoi is aser. And we assumed, because it bothered Rav to see from one Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah, and that makes it like a mafulash. But the implication would be that Rav's concern is not one of Eruv, right? Because he chooses a case of chatzar, right? His issue is that it broke that it broke open to a chatzar. His issue is that it broke open to Rosh Hashanah. If the first break had happened, the implication would be that according to Rav, if the mavoi, its back wall broke and opened into a chatzar, that's not a problem. The only problem is that the second wall broke and therefore it looks mafulash. But the fact that this mavoi opens to chatzar, that I don't have a problem with. I'm not going to preclude them from carrying. So now we're left with the following. We're left with two areas that Rav and Yehuda disagree. So the first one has to do with when a mavoi opens into a chatzar. Forget the second Rosh Hashanah break. When a mavoi opens into a chatzar, Rav Yehuda is saying that's aser because it's paritz b'melua l'makam ha'aser lo. It's entirely open to an area that's aser. So therefore, I can't carry in the mavoi. Whereas so that would be the case where Rav Yehuda says I have a problem with that, and that's why I did not use the case of a chatzar. I used the case of a rechava. Whereas Rav is not worried about that. Rav's only worried about a mafulash, that it's the fact that it's open from one end to the other. So that's the first area they argue. Do I have to worry about a mavoi opening into a chatzar? Rav Yehuda says yes. Rav says no. And what about the fact when you have a mafulash that goes from the front, you have your Rosh Hashanah through your mavoi into a chatzar, into Rosh Hashanah? Rav has a problem with that, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't. How do I know Rabbi Yehuda doesn't? Because it didn't bother him in the case of Rechava, so it's not going to bother him in the case of Chatzar. So we have two areas of disagreement between Rav and Rabbi Yehuda, one about a Mavoi opening into a Chatzar, and one about Mefulish. Okay, so therefore that's the two cases. So I'm just going to read again from the top. The Ida Rav, because this must be a halach of Shmuel when you said that opening in the Rechava, because if it's Rav, Kasha the Rav, Ad Rav Betarti, because we have a stira with Rav in two ways between this halacha that we said on Aman Aleph. Damar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Rav. Mavoi shenifritz b'mulua lechatzar, the case that if a Mavoi opens and it's entirely to a chatzar, v'nifritz a chatzar kenegdo, and the chatzar across from it broke and entered into Rishus HaRabim, chatzar muteres, the chatzar is mutter, Mavoi asr, and the Mavoi is asr. So ask the Gemara, what's the difference between the two cases before? They seem to be arguing in two matters. So therefore, it's clear that the one on Amud Aleph must have been Rabbi Yehuda saying in the name of his Rebbe Shmuel, and the one on Amud Beis is what Rav would hold, which is Rabbi Yehuda's other Rebbe. So his halacha that he said on Amud Aleph about the Rechava is like his Rebbe Shmuel, not like his Rebbe Rav. So Amar Lei, to which, so this was what happened. Rabbi Yosef said to Rabbi Yosef, Abaya said to Rabbi Yosef, this one must be Shmuel, and the halacha the halacha that you said must be Shmuel, because Rav would argue. To which Rav Yosef responded, I don't really care what you're telling me. Ana lo yadana. I have no idea. Maybe you're right. He says uvda hava, but this was a story. We had a rechava, bedura de Ravasa, in the village of, Rashi says the Kfar Roim, the village of the shepherds. And Mavoi shekala l'rechava hava. It was a case where you had a Mavoi that opened into this uninhabited area. V'asa l'kamei de Rabbi Yehuda, and it went in front of Rabbi Yehuda. V'lo itzrach v'lo midi. He didn't require anything. He said a Mavoi. So he says this halacha that I told you on Amud Aleph. Tell me all your things about Rav Shmuel. I was with Rav. I was with Rabbi Yehuda, and he didn't require it. V'i kasha mishmei de Rav. And if you're right that this doesn't work according to Rav, so to have him mishmei de Shmuel, so fine, I accept what you said. So it's Shmuel, big deal. So therefore, this was the case where I said before that it seems that the halacha on Amud Aleph conflicts in two ways with Rav's halacha on Amud Beis. So therefore we're saying fine, the halacha on Amud Beis is Rav, the halacha on Amud Aleph was Shmuel. So now the Gemara says, actually, there's no real argument here. Says the Gemara, v'lo kasha midi. Hashta damar Rav Sheshes Rav Shmuel bar Abba v'amar Rav Yosef bar Abba, because there was a statement that Rav Sheshes said about this halacha of Rav that we learned on Amud Beis, and it made it where it no longer necessarily conflicts with what was said on Amud Aleph. Why? Because he said, Azbra lacha, I'm going to clarify for you. When Rav said his halacha about a mavoi that breaks into a chatzir, kan she'irvu, kan shelo irvu. So he said, that halacha that Rav said is only in a certain case, but not in another. When did Rav say it? Rav said it only in a case where there was no eruv between the two. So if there is no eruv between the two, so then Rav would agree that's the case where Rav said it becomes asur to carry in the mavoi, right? But if I'm sorry, 1 second. So he's saying as follows, that if there's no eruv between them, so then that's the case where Rav says that you cannot carry in the mavoi. But if there would be an eruv between them, then you would be able to carry in the mavoi. So what does that tell us? Once we heard that, we realized that we were wrong in what we thought Rav's problem was. Because we said Rav's problem must be one of Mefulish, right? But if there would not be an opening to the Rishus HaRabim, then Rav would not have a problem. And now we're saying it has nothing to do with Mefulish. It has to do with whether there's an eruv between them or not. So now we're actually, Rav is saying just like Rav Yehuda, which is what? Which is that you have a mavoi, it opens into a chatzir. The problem is, if you have no eruv between the two of them, you cannot carry into the chatzir. If you can't carry into the chatzir, it's a paratz b'melo l'makom ha'aser la, that the mavoi cannot carry into the chatzar, therefore you can't carry into the mavoi. So Rav, when he says mavoi is aser, is saying the exact same halacha as Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said the case of Rechava, because in Rechava you don't need an Eruv, because the Rechava is an uninhabited area. But the implication was, if it was a chatzar, you would need an Eruv, right? So therefore, Rav and Rabbi Yehuda are actually saying the exact same thing. So it's no longer a stira between them. So therefore, continues the Gemara, the Rav ad Rav namin lo kasha. So therefore, from Rav on Rav is also meaning that when you thought if the halacha naman aleph was Rav, it's a problem with the halacha naman beis. It's not true. Kan she'irvu b'nei chatzar and b'nei mavoi, kan shelo irvu. So he's going to say as follows, that Rav is in perfect agreement with Rabbi Yehuda, and if there is no eruv between the two, then you cannot carry in the mavoi, because the mavoi is fully open to the chatzar, which is aser to carry into, and therefore it's aser to carry in the mavoi. If, however, there would be a eruv between them, or we're dealing with a rechava in the back, which is an uninhabited area and therefore doesn't require an eruv, in those cases it's mutter. So what are we coming out? We're coming out that unlike what we thought in the beginning, Rav is not worried about mafulush. It's an eruv issue. It's not a mafulush issue. Everyone is going to be in agreement for right now. Now, why, by the way, are we in agreement? We're going to see this in the Gemara in a second, but I'll tell you now. Why are we in agreement that we're not worried about mafulush? Because at the end of the day, what you have here is you have your Rishus Rabim, you have your Mavoi, and then you go into the Chatzar extends to the right and left. So people see that's a different area. That's not the Mavoi going straight all the way to Rishus Rabim. It's Mavoi followed by a widening, which is obviously a Chatzar, followed by an entrance to Rishus Rabim. So that's clear to people that it's not a Mavoi Mafulush, and therefore we don't require anything more. So that's going to be the halacha, and they're going to be entirely in agreement. So now, just to get us, first of all, tomorrow's a long daf, and second of all, to get us to a logical ending here, we're just going to finish the Gemara quickly. Says the Gemara, and this is what the structure I told you before. So we started off saying the memra on Amud Aleph must be Shmuel because it can't be Rav because it was a conflict with Rav on Amud Beis. Then we said no, Rav on Amud Beis and the memra on Amud Aleph don't conflict with each other. Therefore, the memra on Amud Aleph could in fact be Rav, or it could be Shmuel. We don't know, but there's no conflict. And now the Gemara is saying, but wait a second, explain to me, and I've already explained it to you really, so hopefully this Gemara will go relatively easy. So explain to me, when you thought they were arguing, what would they have been arguing about? So says the Gemara, So he says, but according to what I thought in the beginning, which this was not an Erev issue, and this was a Mafulush issue, so then what did they think they were arguing about? What was going on here? Be'irvu my pligi, b'shalo irvu my pligi. And so in the case of Irvu, where they actually had an Erev, and we thought there's still a problem because Rav has an issue with Mafulush, what were they arguing about when they were talking about Mafulush? Why did Rav think Mafulush was a problem and Shmuel did not think it was? Because again, we're going in the Havamina. And B'shalo Irvu b'mai pligi, when we were talking about Lo Irvu, and we weren't dealing with a Mafulush issue, we were dealing with a question of a Mavoi opening into a Chatzar, and if they're don't have an Eruv, that Rabbi Yehuda had a problem and Rav didn't have a problem, what were they thinking in that case? So says the Gemara, B'shalo Irvu pligi, the case where we're not dealing with an Eruv, we're not dealing with a Mafulush problem, and we're dealing with an Eruv problem. So what was the case? We had as follows. They have a Mavoi opening into a Chatzar that's wider than it. The Mavoi is fully open to the Chatzar. The Chatzar is a place you can't carry. So we said that is Paretz b'melu al makom ha'aser lo, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda said that that's a problem, and therefore you can't carry in the Mavoi. But the question is, as I told you before, Paretz b'melu al makom ha'aser lo is a general halach and eruv. So why did Rav not seem to have a problem? His only issue was Mafulush in our Havamina. Why did he not have a problem with carrying in the Mavui if the Mavui was open in its entirety to a Chatzar which it could not carry into? So the Gemara says, what they were arguing about is a topic that Amir Tashem will see tomorrow, on Wednesday, which has to do with the following. From the perspective of standing in the Mavui, you're right, it's fully open to the Chatzar. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda says, you're fully open to a Makam that's Asr, and therefore you can't carry in the Mavui. But Rav had a view, we thought, although this was only in the Havamim, it doesn't work out this way, that, wait a second, go stand in the chutzner. So the chutzner is not fully open to the mavoi. The chutzner, we said, was a T. It's wider than the mavoi. So therefore, if I'm standing in the chutzner and looking back at the mavoi, I see that it's not fully open. They're not lined up one next to the other. The mavoi is much more narrow than the chutzner. So therefore, Rav was saying, I am going to look from the outside. From the outside, it's not fully open, and therefore it's not a case of parts b'malua and l'makam aser lo. It's not parts b'malua. Rav and Rav Yehuda was saying in the Havamina, no, you have to look at it from standing inside the mavoi. When I'm inside the mavoi, all I see is my entire mavoi is broken down into a chutzner, and therefore it's parts b'malua and l'makam aser lo. So we're going to say that was in the Havamina what we thought they were arguing about. Now what about when we thought that they were arguing, even if there would be an Eruv between them, it seemed that Rav had an issue that it was mefulish, and Rabbi Yehuda didn't seem to care about mefulish, because in the case of Rechava, it didn't bother Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara said, but the Rabbi Yosef, they're actually arguing about Rabbi Yosef. It's interesting. All right, I won't get into it. But Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef says, Lo shanu ela shekala le'emtza Rechava. So Rabbi Yosef said as follows, this that we said, that Rabbi Yehuda allowed you to go in and through the Rechava, right? That's only true if it was a T, the way we said. It's where you had the Mavoi, you had a wider Chatzar, and then the opening to the Rosh Hashanah. So he says, Avokala letzidei Rechava aser. But let's say, instead of looking like a T, this looked like an L. You had your Mavoi, and then you had your Rechava, but this left wall was even throughout. So first you had your wall of the mavoi, then you had the width of the chutzner, and then you had your break to the Rosh Hashanah. So now you have one straight wall that looks like it. So that, we're going to say, is, Rav Yosef's chiddush is that Rav Yehuda would say, even when you're dealing with a rechava, which has no diurin and has no residence, nonetheless, if there's a straight wall from the front of this Rosh Hashanah to the front to that Rosh Hashanah, even though you're traversing both a mavoi and a rechava, in that case you don't do it. So what does that tell you? That introduces the concept that the T is important, because when you're looking at the T, you're seeing your mavoi, but then you see it expands wider, and therefore you know that you're dealing with a different area, in this case a rechava or a chatzar, and therefore I'm not worried about mafulash. So the issue, so once we say, so that's what the Gemara says. If we weren't dealing with an Erev issue, we're just dealing with a Mefulish issue, so then what on earth? We understand Rav. Rav says it looks like a Mefulish, but what was Rav Yehuda thinking? So we see once Rav Yosef tells us that Rav Yehuda, in order to say his halacha, requires a T and not an L, so it gives us insight as to why Rav Yehuda wasn't worried. Because he felt you have a mavoi, you see that it expands, and then you go out. So that's what we're going to say. So we're going to end here. But that's what we're going to say was the issue, the machlokas in the Havamina between Rav Yehuda, because Rav Yehuda said, because there's a T, I'm not worried about it. And Rav said, look, I can look straight through from this Rosh Hashanah to that Rosh Hashanah, so we're going to treat it like a mafulish. But again, both these machloksim that we had about to understand the Rav Yehuda was only saying it with a T, and the issue of this question of maybe I look from the inside or the outside, all of that was to explain the Havamina, but actually the memra that Rav Yehuda said on Amud Aleph was dealing with the Rechava, and the memra on Amud Beis was Rav was dealing with a Chatzar. But in all cases they agree, if you can carry from the Mavoi to the back, whether it's a Rechava because it has no inhabitants or a Chatzar because you did an Eruv, everyone agrees is not a problem. If you cannot carry from the Mavoi to the Chatzar because there was no Eruv, everyone would agree in that case too that it's parts b'malua l'makam ha'aser law, that you have a Mavoi opening into a Chatzar. Since you can't carry from the Mavoi to the Chatzar, you can't carry in the Mavoi either. Have a good day.